Howdy folks! Today's video is all about the super tall tower in HunterxHunter, the iconic Heaven's Arena. So we'll spend the next few minutes evaluating the tower from an architecture and engineering perspective. So let's go and see what's happening at the impressive structure.
And who are you?
Oh, me? I'm Nick. I make videos on structures. It's a YouTube channel. So, HunterxHunter. It's an awesome beat-em-up shonen anime, but with some sweet deviations from the usual formula. For narrative context, pretty early in the story, after completing the Hunter exam, main characters Gon and Killua make their way to Heaven's Arena as a means for gaining battle experience and maybe making some cash along the way. The tower operates as a multi-level combat arena where victorious fighters ascend up the tower's many floors, and that's exactly what the kids do over their dozen or so chapters there, with Gon and Killua manhandling the first 190 levels to finally face the big boys at the 200th floor. There, Gon and Killua are introduced to the concept of Nen, the defining spiritual energy system of the series, like Dragon Ball's Ki or Naruto's Chakra. And if I'm honest with myself, the introduction of the Nen system is probably the author's crown jewel of this arc, but God, I just love a good tower, so let's go check that out. For once in my experience evaluating fantasy structures, the creators actually give us some real data to work with. Not only does the tower have precisely 251 floors, but right off the bat, Killua tells us it stands at 991 meters tall, like he's reading it off the Hunter website, which at the time of this writing would make Heaven's Tower the tallest building on Earth by about 150 meters, though of course HunterxHunter occurs on another planet, definitely not Earth. This is another planet. But after Killua's exposition, we're not told an incredible amount more about the tower, so here's what we've got. So while they say there is an arena at every level in the 2011 anime, the contestants move up the tower 10 levels at a time, which leads me to believe that there may only be an arena every 10 floors, and this makes a decent amount of sense with 251 floors spread out over a 991 meter height. We're left with a floor on average every 4 meters, and with the fighting arenas themselves appearing to house several thousand spectators rising dozens of meters in height, it's hard to buy that we can fit that many arenas in here, even if some of them may hang off the side. Additionally, the tower apparently plays host to over 1 billion visitors every year to watch and bet on the epic bouts, with hotel rooms, retail, and services up the height. And once Gon and Killua get up to level 100, they even get a room rent-free during their stay, kinda like Vegas. Now, as far as the exterior architectural expression goes, it seems to be clad in a galvanized metal panel of sorts with few windows and a hodgepodge of jettying elements that make the building look like unplanned architecture, though I don't imagine that's the case as other buildings in the neighborhood don't really have the same aesthetic. So, as I've kept the tower imagery on the screen for the last minute, if you've been thinking to yourself, boy, this looks familiar, well, you wouldn't be wrong. Heaven's Arena has some striking similarities in form with the current world's tallest building, Dubai's Burj Khalifa. It has a similar slender tapering with a series of step-backs as it arises, though the Middle Eastern counterpart is mostly clad in glass. More interesting still is that the Heaven's Arena arc would have been written in the 90s, at least 6 years before the design of the Burj began, and a decade before its completion. It's funny to think that someone within the Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill design team could have drawn inspiration from Yoshihiro Tagashi's tower. Is it more likely that an architectural form like this is simply the best way to make a super tall tower? Maybe, but not necessarily. The second tallest building in the world, the Merdeka 118, would certainly beg to differ. And in all truth, the form similarities come to a close when we stop looking in 2 dimensions and begin to think in 3D. Heaven's Tower appears to have a generally cylindrical shape if we can ignore the jetties, while the Burj Khalifa is shaped and planned like the letter Y, shrinking each leg at intervals, spiraling up the tower, which isn't simply an ode to the Muslim architecture that it intends to take inspiration from, but is actually an incredibly efficient shape for high-rise buildings. And yeah, I mean, the structural design of the Burj Khalifa could obviously be a very long video in its own right, and not really something I plan on reviewing, but we will use that and other references ahead. The famous structural engineer Fazlur Khan was widely regarded for his developments within the design of high-rise buildings and was instrumental in the design of the Sears, now Willis Tower, then the tallest building in the world. And in his experience, Khan had come up with this simple graph describing the amount of structural steel in column, beam, and braced framed buildings with relation to their height, and notes a separation between the cost associated with gravity resisting elements, the weight of the building and its functions, and the lateral load resisting elements, typically wind, though earthquakes stress the lateral system as well. And evidently, the gravity system increases linearly with the number of stories, but steel dedicated to the lateral systems increases exponentially, almost as though the simplified equation governing overturning for this sort of configuration depended on the square of the height. So, the reason we know Fazlur Khan's name is because he is attributed with developing something called tube designs for high-rise structures. In short, it's like simplifying the building as a tube sticking out of the ground to resist lateral loads with the widest base possible and engaging tightly spaced columns tied together with sturdy beams at each level. And it seems that this tube design could work for the structural system of Heaven's Arena, with a few caveats. Unlike the tube design examples from before, we don't have these oppressively long and straight load paths from top to bottom because of these jutting and receding elements of Heaven's Arena dancing at random up the height. We're not always left with direct load paths along the literal perimeter of the tube, though it wouldn't be impossible that this tube is inset from the least common diameter, if you will, and the rest cantilevers off of that. And that might seem like a structural inconvenience imposed by the architectural programming. However, something that these varying cross-sections could do to benefit the structure is confuse the wind, baffle it. In a similar way that the Burj Khalifa uses its varying plan shape to disrupt vortex shedding effects from accumulating up the height, the same could be said of Hunter's Arena, though I can't say I have any background in computational fluid dynamics. I just sometimes read wind testing reports. Back to the structural system, we do get a fair bit of freedom in assuming how it works, as there is very little of the interior structure shown to us in the manga and anime, except for a few random columns here and there. And to shoehorn a justification in, a ridiculously thin column like this might even be reasonable in a tube design which can span from the perimeter tube to a core system without interior columns, like the World Trade Center buildings. Now, typically when we're reviewing something on this channel, it's because of some defiance of logic, something unintuitive, or just highlighted by the realm of the fantasy world, but that's not exactly what we have with Heaven's Arena, as it's only a few hundred feet taller than the Burj Khalifa and would actually be shorter than the Saudi Kingdom Tower if that ever gets built. But one element of fantasy, or at least where HunterxHunter asks me to suspend my disbelief, is in the programming of these arenas. Like, where the hell are they? I suppose some of these protruding elements could serve as arenas, but I don't think that we have the same structures cantilevering every 10 levels, so we have to assume some of them are housed within the building envelope. So that raises the question for me of how large might these arenas be? The context from the manga and anime varies a little bit, with some housing one level of seating, others housing two, and depending on the panel, the fighting space of the arena can look smaller than a basketball court or larger than a hockey rink. So I'll take the liberty of using my local semi-pro sports facility as an example. The Cedar Park Center seats up to 7,000 people during sporting events, with most seats on the lower of two levels, switching over to Imperial units because this is America. I estimate the facility is near 95,000 square feet, but a good chunk of that is on the concourse with vendors, circulation, and so on. Then taking just the area of the arena and its seating space, it's probably less than half of that, let's say 36,000 square feet, on average measuring 215 feet across. Now, hold these numbers in your head. Well, actually, you know what, I'll put them up here. So, if this is the expected size for the typical arena in the HunterxHunter Tower, how does this size up? If I take this view that removes all perspective, and yeah, I mean, the arena isn't drawn proportionally consistent each time it appears, so, I mean, this is just wrong, but that's the trouble with putting real numbers to most fantasy designs. Anyways, I like this picture, so we'll go with this. Now, if the tower is supposed to be 1,000 meters in height, then the base would seem to be about 1/6 as wide, or maybe 165 meters at its widest. Well, if that's the case, then it's pretty evident that an arena could easily fit within the lower levels, and an example would be the big one that Gon and Killua start out on. Perhaps midway up, over half of the floor space gets taken up by the arena. Still no problem, right? Well, at that point we start to lose the ability to place any interior columns to support the floors above, as arenas are almost definitionally column-free spaces. The solution to that can be by using transfer girders to pick up loads from above and transfer to where there are vertical force-resisting elements, columns. But these transfer girders can be massive, even multiple stories tall in some cases, and logistically, things can get tricky. Elevators, for example, really like to move in straight lines. So assuming we can make that work at the middle levels, at the 200th floor and up, the building diameter shrinks significantly, down to maybe 175 feet if we scale it roughly, which would make for pretty tight quarters unless we mount the arena off the side. And sure enough, in a later manga chapter yet to be animated, that's confirmed when one of the arenas is demolished in a fight, and the smoke shown from the street level specifically emanates from one of these cantilevering structures. Now, the engineering design of cantilevering an arena full of people is already an insane undertaking, but even more wild is mounting it off of the side of the fourth tallest building in the world, especially near its pinnacle. It would induce huge overturning loads, torsional loads, and story shear, and that would all require heavy structure to resist. So to give a couple of examples of buildings that apply dramatic cantilevers are the Denver Art Museum that cantilevers 167 feet, the Antwerp Port Authority that's much beloved, and the Burj Al Arab sports one of the highest helipads in the world. And I bring these examples up because this appears to be the extent that we're comfortable building here, at least in the early 21st century. Analytically, these hanging structures induce significant deformations that, if overextended, even if over-reinforced for strength, would still droop, move, and vibrate in ways that would be very unsettling. An upper-level Heaven's Arena might experience so much deflection that spectators on the far ends might feel like they're riding waves, oscillating up and down, side to side, under moderate winds. For viewers that have visited the Burj Khalifa, imagine that experience but magnified a dozen times over. So after doing a good chunk of research for this video, I realized there was one major resource that I had kind of overlooked. The HunterxHunter movie, The Last Mission. This movie, while not technically canon, takes place almost entirely in the upper levels of Heaven's Arena and adds a few interesting details of the tower that both agree and disagree with what we've discussed up to this point. First, there is this epic fight scene that pits Gon against this guy. I'm not going to bother looking up the name, and based on the Rotten Tomato reviews, I don't expect that will offend many people. And the fight carries them into the elevator shaft where we're shown some of the interior steel framing, and while some of it feels random, there are some chevron braces shown, chevron meaning the reference to the shape, not the oil and gas company. Distractions aside, what this tells me, if I take it literally, is that we wouldn't have just a tube structural system as described before, but likely a double tube lateral system that nests a smaller one at the core while still utilizing the perimeter tube system to do the lion's share of the work. And this isn't just something rooted in fantasy, but a system that does exist in some cases. The second notable point is about wall construction. Gon punches his way through the side at one point, and here we get a glimpse of the wall's constitution, which in classic shonen form just looks like a thick piece of rock, or maybe concrete, that has a thin metal veneer to match what we see on the outside. Now, does this mean we have an unreinforced concrete structure instead? Probably not. I really want to chalk this up to the creators not wanting to put a thin wall on this big building, or making a thick piece of rock looking material to show just how strong Gon is, because a load-bearing wall this thick on an upper level means the lower levels would just be all wall.
Jerry, these are load-bearing walls!
Last, a third and small reference to the architecture of the building occurs during Gon's fight, where Killua recognizes that the elevator shaft didn't have any cables and instead uses a magnetic system to carry the elevator car up rails. And this magnet ends up playing a big role in taking down the bad guy, but I've never seen anything like this before in practice, so I had to look it up. Are maglev elevators used anywhere in building construction? And the answer is, kind of. You wouldn't have ridden in one yet, but worldwide elevator supplier ThyssenKrupp is currently testing and developing them in this cool-looking facility in Germany. Now, I imagine these are still a long ways off, if for no other reason than building codes as usual will be slow to adapt. And there may be other aspects of the structure that are expanded on within the movie that I didn't touch on. Let me know if you think so. So this feels like a reasonable place to wrap up the discussion on the design considerations of the epic Heaven's Arena. We've gone over everything from architectural form, high-rise structural systems, structural solutions for programming an arena within the walls, and even vertical transportation systems. And wow, this was really fun for me. Though I've been aware of the series for a long time, I hadn't started HunterxHunter until recently. So I hope longtime fans don't take any perceived criticisms too seriously. I personally don't think it's problematic if a shonen writer takes some creative liberties, especially here where they're used to make an epic sophomore arc. I just think it's super fun to poke and prod around fantasy structures for what we can learn about them, and learn I did, since Togashi structure is such a cool concept that I really enjoyed studying. So if you've stuck around this far, please leave a like or comment your thoughts. There was probably a fair bit more that could have been delved into, but anyways, thanks for hanging out. Adios.